Hello, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, wherever you are on this beautiful planet of ours. Welcome to Sustainability in Your Ear. This is the podcast conversation about accelerating the transition to a sustainable carbon neutral society. And I'm your host, Mitch Ratcliffe. Thanks for joining the conversation today. Being a consumer in an advanced economy, or any economy these days, is challenging because you cannot keep up with the ever-changing range of ingredients and materials used in the products at the store. For example, tens of thousands of new chemicals are registered annually with the Food and Drug Administration, but many more compounds that could be harmful are introduced and used in manufacturing, and these chemicals can harm our health and the environment. But many tools for interrogating our world and the products we buy are emerging, offering deeper insights into the health and environmental impact of our lifestyles. Our guest today is Stephen Fuller, Senior Criteria Manager at TCO Development, a globally recognized driver of sustainable practices for technology products that's based in Stockholm, Sweden. With over 350,000 chemicals in use today and only a small fraction of those subjected to risk assessment, TCO has developed disclosures about the chemicals used in information technology products. The organization introduced its Accepted Substances List, a catalog of safer chemical alternatives vetted by organizations like Greenscreen and ChemForward. TCO is hoping to drive semiconductor, computer, phone, and TV manufacturers, among others, to adopt materials that meet rigorous environmental and social responsibility standards. So get ready. We're going to dive into TCO Development's efforts and the challenge of managing the complex web of chemicals used in IT products throughout their life cycles. You can learn more about TCO Development at TCO Certified. TCO Certified is all one word, no space, no dash, tcocertified.com. We'll be right back to begin the conversation after this brief commercial break. Welcome to the show, Stephen. How are you doing today?
Very good. Yeah, it's nice to be talking to you about this important issue.
It's good to have TCO Development back on. We've talked with you all before about product passports and so forth. But what I wanted to jump in and start with is, what motivated TCO to focus on safer chemical alternatives rather than, for instance, advocating bans of chemicals?
Yeah, well, it's a bit of a story, but it's worth telling from the start. Because TCO, we had this long-term goal that's aimed about ensuring IT products are brought by companies and government offices, and they're healthier and safer along the whole life cycle, really. So part of the goal that we work with is that we've included chemicals, chemicals of concern, usually ahead of regulatory requirements like REACH, EU REACH, and RoHS. And our inclusion of chemicals, it's one of our focus areas. We include also climate, circularity, and supply chains. But back in the 90s, because of the health concerns with heavy metals and halogenated flame retardants, we started, restriction, just like everybody else does now, focusing on restriction. But during our criteria updates, which we do every 3 years, we started to notice that, these restrictions weren't leading to safer products. So we decided about 2012, I think it was, that we turned the table on this. We do the opposite instead. And we decided to show manufacturers what to use instead. And, not what not to use, but what to use. Because what not to use was just leading to equally or more hazardous, chemicals coming into the product. So the real motivator here was that our change was safer chemicals. If we wanted to switch to safer chemicals, that wasn't going to happen with restriction. The use of safer alternatives needed to be required. And that's the benefit of being a certification with the support of thousands of purchasers around the world, that we can demand this kind of thing. We can demand that the better solution is chosen. Once industry start to see the benefits of that, it becomes easier. So in 2015, we launched the very first public accepted substance list for safer flame retardants that were used in certified products.
Talk a little about the constituency that you just described, the buyers, the IT buyers. So you've assembled the influencers, in a sense, to exert some influence over the decisions being made by IT manufacturers. How do you communicate with that group, and how did they help you set the agenda?
Yeah, well, it's TCO certified is used by both public and private procurers around the world. We've grown through the years from the 90s. We're a part of tenders, and this is big money to industry. I mean, they want to win these tenders. This is like hundreds and thousands of computers that they're going to be able to sell. We get the support because we're driving new demands. We're driving like innovation. We're staying ahead to remain relevant to as a certification. You've got to keep ahead of legislation, basically. And that's what purchasers like about us, that we're taking risks with the certification. We're trying new methods, new ways to solve an issue as we're doing with chemicals. And that's what they like. And they give us our support to do that. And because we update every 3 years, we're always looking for the next issue, the next problem to solve. And and chemicals has been something that we've seen that it hasn't led to safer substitution with just
Yeah.
restriction. And we needed to get the backing of the purchasers, the global purchaser. And it wasn't that hard to get when it comes to chemicals, I must say.
Let's just very briefly explore what we're talking about. How does substances like a degreaser or the material used to clean semiconductor surfaces reaching our bodies and the environment? A lot of people think about the materials that are just directly used, but there's a variety of other chemicals applied in the process which can also impact us. How does that work?
Yeah, so it comes down to handling. Well, workers on the supply chain, perhaps they don't have the right training to handle the chemical. They're not, they're not given the correct data, which is called a safety data sheet. They don't have access to this. And all workers should be given training to the chemical that they are sort of like at risk of being exposed to. And on that, they have to be given the correct personal protective equipment. And
Right.
this really is something that we saw wasn't happening either in a lot of the manufacturing places. Another risk that we saw when we were, researching the kind of chemicals that were being used as cleaning solvents on production lines were chemicals that had been for a long time restricted, in Europe. And in the US. I mean, we're talking about benzene and hexane, methanol, and these kind of cleaning solvents that are really sort of like been restricted for a long time. But they were starting to appear in the in Asia and the factories there, and the exposure risk and the kind of impact that they were having on the workers' health was quite apparent, really. I mean, when you get non-government organizations and doing research and the impact that the chemicals was having on the workers, we decided that this is something we have to do something about. There are safer alternatives out there. We have to, of course, work with getting the training, the right personal protective equipment, but there's always a risk of exposure, even when you have the right equipment. And of course, the handling at the end when the chemical has to be disposed of, the rest of the chemical needs to be disposed of. And if that kind of how it's like disposed of properly. And these sometimes, can be risks that you have to look into and to see that the system is working properly and correctly.
So part of this is simply raising awareness so the manufacturers are aware of it, of the potential risk both to their employees and to the local environment. But you're working with several different organizations in order to do the reviews, Green Screen and Chem Forward being two of the primary ones. What does that process look like, and how long does it take to review a new material when it comes to your attention?
Sometimes, an idea to succeed is all about timing.
Mhm.
So when we made up our minds to start the accepted substance list back in 2012, which we launched in 2015, there was a hazard assessment framework called Green Screen for safer
Mhm.
chemicals that was making an impact around then. It was mostly around for textiles, but there was a big US electronics brand also using Green Screen in some respects. Green Screen, they had an independent toxicologist group, which they called the licensed profilers, and these profilers collect what's available, the public data that's available, so that they can do an assessment, a rigorous assessment of, there's 18 hazard endpoints or hazard points that cover human and environmental impact. But a lot of these databases, they're a bit limited with the information. Some of it's very confidential. that chemical suppliers aren't willing to share with public databases. And these are called data gaps. So these 18 hazard endpoints could have too many data gaps to be able to do a full assessment on. And this is
Right.
the beauty about the accepted substance list, is that when you start an accepted substance list and you don't share that data, that test data, with the profiler, with the toxicologist, then they will set a benchmark which is called unspecified. So there's not enough data to set a credible benchmark. And with the ASL, you can also restrict these unspecified benchmarks that don't have enough data by saying, well, there is a potential risk that it is equally as hazardous as the one is going to replace. So we can't be sure. So that's why
Mm-hmm.
it should be restricted. We only accept the chemicals that have been assessed and proven to be safer. So this, in respect, forces the chemical industry, if they want to retain business and they want to, to retain business with their clients, they have to share that data. And then a full assessment can be done. And then if it gets an accepted benchmark score from the green screen profiler, it can be added to the accepted substance list. So with over 350,000 unique chemicals on the global market, green screen is really helping us to understand where to find those safer choices instead of what not to use. And there's also another tool that we have started to use, which is called Chem Forward, and that's an alternative to green screen that we added this year as an alternative assessment framework.
With only 1% of those 350,000 chemicals that are in use having actually been risk assessed, do you depend on green screen and Chem Forward to determine where to deploy the review resources, or do you and them get together and figure out how to deploy your resources?
Yeah, well, this is the important difference between, restricted substance lists and accepted substance list strategies. I mean, the sheer volume of chemicals is only really a challenge if you're using a restricted substance list strategy, because it means basically that you need to go through every chemical to find out where those hazardous ones
Yeah.
are. And that demands a lot of resources, especially with new chemicals being registered with the CAS numbers every 2 minutes. It's basically near impossible. But the accepted substance list is so much easier because it restricts every alternative and only need list those that are proven to be safer. So if I say that I've identified 100 flame retardants that are used on IT products, and we have 25 safer flame retardants on our accepted substance list. But I didn't need to test the other 85. They didn't need to be assessed. Since those 25, they are providing all the needs of the manufacturers to meet fire safety standards. So although if the chemical supplier wants to add one of those 85, then they have to go through, the assessment. They get
Right.
to choose. They want to retain business, and it's part of their portfolio of safer substitutions. So they need to go through and contact Chem Forward or the green screen to get the chemical assessed. And then once it's been assessed and proven to be safer, then it can be added to our accepted substance list. So that's the process.
Deciding not to do enforcement, but to provide information, you're facilitating a lot of different choices, not just the choice of the end user who's buying this material, but also these organizations who are seeking to reach customers who are looking for a safer alternative. So the question, I guess, is how do you determine what's safer? What are the criteria for determining that something should be on the accepted substances list?
Yeah. So a hazard assessment framework, it focuses on several factors that include, toxicity to humans and the environment. What's bioaccumulative? What's the potential of bioaccumulation and that environmental persistence that is going to persist in nature and do harm, and create more exposure risk, basically, with consideration to the whole of the product life cycle. These hazard assessment frameworks, they even go as far as to assess, well, what is, a transformation risk. And that's like the chemical's ability to transform into something toxic when it comes in contact with the environment. the considerations are so far reaching. It's really a full assessment of the chemical. For a chemical to be considered safer, then it has to meet our minimum, the minimum level of data. It can't be like too many data gaps. And this is what I'm on about when, if there are too many data gaps from the authoritative list, like from REACH or other databases, and we think it's TSCA, and these databases can be limited. We need to find out if it's safer or not safer. Not having enough public data assessment means that the chemical supplier will need to share it, basically. Otherwise, it won't be enough data to make an educated assessment and place it on our accepted substance list.
I'm curious, how do you deal with the fact that many of those impacts might only be identified through a longitudinal study in an environment where innovation drives all sorts of new materials introductions with a lot of urgency? How do you take the time necessary to understand the long-term consequences, or are some of these acceptances provisional?
So it's really crucial to consider the whole life cycle of the product, when deciding on the choice of chemical. Exposure to chemical additives happens along the whole life cycle of the product. There's exposure, in the production line to workers, and the environment at the end of life disposal. We need to consider that too. And this is something that, the hazard assessment framework, takes into consideration. A chemical that makes it onto the accepted substance list it's on our accepted substance list. They're all being used, and they've all been shown to be the safe alternatives. They just weren't being used by every brand owner or every manufacturer. It was just one of the two that were using the safe alternatives. Perhaps it was something to do with winning a tender that the purchaser placed higher demands on the type of chemicals that were used as flame retardants. So this is the beauty of having an accepted substance list that is completely transparent, because the accepted substance list on our website is completely public and available to everybody to see. So we wanted to set a level playing field where everybody was using proven chemicals. New chemistry comes in, and there can be quite a delay, but these chemical suppliers, they have portfolios. They have portfolios of very cheap, regrettable substitutions that are perfect for a certain application. They have a lot in reserve, basically, or they have the more expensive ones, which are, a lot more healthier for humans and the environment, that are for a specific application. But I think the problem really comes when, if you start to restrict a chemical that is used by everyone. I've started to notice this, excuse me, I started to notice this with power cables. It's kind of like a flame retardant. That's the go-to flame retardant. It gets into every market basically around the world because it's suitable for higher safety standards, the electrical safety standards. And they haven't really been prepared that, even though it's been known that this is a highly hazardous chemical, the argument has been, well, there's no viable alternative for this. But, we've now started the process because, we don't allow hazardous flame retardants, even in cables, with TCO certified product. This is part of the latest generation that we're expanding to in TCO certified. That in TCO certified generation 10, the electrical cables must only contain plasticizers, flame retardants, and stabilizers that are on the accepted substance list. So all of a sudden, this go-to flame retardant is now very much restricted, and they have to start the process of finding the safer alternatives and using the safer alternatives that we have on the accepted substance list. And this creates a turmoil of, well, it has to go through tests. It has to go for electrical safety tests also. These electrical safety tests can take, weeks and months before they're finalized. So this is the kind of problem that you face when you're restricting a chemical that is so established within the industry that they haven't really thought through the backup plan of when it becomes restricted.
How many buyers are using TCO standards in their tenders? I mean, it sounds like that really is the critical factor here, is how much market influence TCO can exert.
Yeah, I can't really say I have that number in my head. I'm working with criteria development, but we
Mhm.
do have a purchaser engagement team working at TCO certified, and they know that answer better than I do. Unfortunately, I don't know that, but I know it's very much established around a lot of the companies that are purchasing, both public and private in Europe. I know that it's referred to and used in the US.
Mhm.
Also, I just heard today that perhaps New York State was using TCO certified as a requirement. So, it's growing all the time, but I can't give you a specific number, unfortunately.
The point being that there's a great many organizations using your criteria to make some of their purchase decisions.
Yes, yeah, it's been that way since the 90s. That they see what we're doing, they like what we're doing. It helps them with the requirements they have on them to make sustainable purchases with public and with the public money. So we have their support, so that's good.
Well, there's a lot more to cover here, but we're going to take a quick commercial break. We'll be right back to continue the discussion. Well, enough of those commercials. Now back to the discussion with Stephen Fuller, Senior Criteria Manager at TCO Development, which has a product passport technology that we've discussed on previous shows. Stephen leads the TCO Development Accepted Substances List program for safer, more environmentally responsible technology products. So, Stephen, we've talked a little about TSCA, the Toxic Substance Control Act here in the United States, and the EU has the REACH registry, which is an acronym for which I am not going to try to explain. How does TCO, Reach, and Tosca interact to influence the kinds of decisions that we were talking about before the break, the purchase decisions?
Yeah, so well, the way the interaction is that what we do aligns closely with the TSCA and the EU REACH, the SVHCs, the substances of very high concern list, as well as other authoritative lists like Prop 65 or the Stockholm Convention of POPs and POPs. Since these tools or these registries work to help compile the hazard assessment on the chemical. So this means that the data they collect helps us to understand if a chemical should be avoided. But what these sources aren't so good at doing is understanding which chemicals should be used instead. So what the alternative is, which alternative suits that specific application. If you need a flame retardant for a cable, or if you need encasing or a plasticizer for the cable, which alternative suits that application. And these aren't so good at showing that. So it's difficult also to leverage REACH, I think, which continues with its restriction list strategy and only recommends the use of safer alternatives, even though we're referred to as being a best practice approach. So unfortunately, there are many chemical industry lobbyists, active in Brussels, that are preventing this kind of change that we need to see when it comes to chemical management. To answer your question, these registries, they're a good source of information, but not all the information is there. There's a lot of data gaps that can make it hard to do a full assessment. So for a full assessment, as I said earlier, to be able to identify what's safer, some of that test data has to come from the chemical suppliers, who are likely holding back from these public databases because of confidentiality.
Is it really confidentiality, or is it more concern that their new material might be identified as a risk and therefore make their product less attractive to buyers? Do you have a sense of that?
Yeah, for sure. I have a sense that it's both those issues. Confidentiality continues to be, a big hindrance when it comes to looking at the process chemicals that are used in the factories. These are usually very complex formulations. A formulation can be sort of like 4 or 5 different chemicals.
Yeah.
It usually comes down to the kind of the level of that each chemical is at, their concentration levels, which they don't like to share. But yeah, I think also, as you were into that, it holding back the information could present a risk that this chemical should be avoided.
Well, the information technology industry does have the example of open source software, which emerged back in the 90s around the time you all were getting started. Do you believe that there's a move towards greater transparency in the industry, or to what you were just saying, is that veil of confidentiality still preventing IT buyers from having true insight into the environmental and health impacts of the products they buy?
Yeah, we can do what we do as long as we don't give out the full concentration levels of the chemicals that we have on our list. So what we do is we present the CES number, the chemical name. The CES number is the unique identifier that we're after, and of course the benchmark score. But we can't really give out more details than that about the concentration levels, because that is confidential information. They worry that if they give out too information, competitors will be able to get hold of it, and the manufacturers can go to whichever chemical supplier they want to, because they have the concentrations, they have the right mix. There's also, what I'm looking into now is the adhesives and the lubricants that are used in the production factories. Here we also have very complex formulations. What I hope is that we can put together a list of these CES numbers, these unique chemicals. But once again, we won't be able to do the concentration levels. But what could be an alternative, if they want to keep confidentiality of the types of chemicals that are in a product, is that this product is assessed as a complete product, that every chemical in that formulation has to get an accepted bench level score, accepted level. And we only inform on our accepted substance list the trade name. So the trade name chemical has been through the full assessment with an independent licensed green screen profiler. But we're not listing the CAS numbers. We're only listing the trade name. But we are sure that each of those chemicals that are in that formulation has been proven to be safer.
Are there examples of substances that have been traditionally used in IT products but were replaced as a result of the safer alternatives being promoted by TCO?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, what we've seen before, what's been replaced is, of course, all the halogenated flame retardants that are in the product. There's all types of hazardous phthalates that are used as plasticizers. The EU ROS, they added, I think it was back in 2018, they added 4 phthalates to their restricted list, which they call ROS. But research showed us that the alternatives that were going to be used, those 4, could be equally hazardous or potentially equally hazardous. They haven't been assessed enough to close that data, but there were some that were equally as hazardous. So it wasn't really leading anywhere. There were all types of cleaning solvents that had come back in Asia. The benzene, the toluene, the methanol was being used again. And this is something that we've managed to remove from the production lines where TCO certified production is happening. And now we're looking at the lead-based stabilizers. Lead-based stabilizers were still being used for the durability of the cables. Here we also see that there are enough safe alternatives out there. So these are types of chemicals that we've managed to phase out from IT products.
We've had TCO on before to talk about product passports, as I mentioned during the introduction. And I'm wondering, as you all think about how to inform enterprise IT buyers and ultimately even potentially consumers about the chemicals that they're being exposed to through IT products, how do you envision surfacing this information in more actionable ways and propagating it to larger audiences who are impacted by this, but maybe have been depending on the procurement professional to make those decisions before? Now they would like to understand the decision.
Yeah, so the product passports, they're expected to include information about the chemicals that are used in the product. This kind of transparency is going to allow everyone to make informed decisions based on the chemical profilers of the IT products. So as we do with the accepted substance list today, we intend that the product passport will also provide that chemical transparency. But for now, if people want to know what's being used in a certified product today, or on the factory production lines manufacturing certified products, then they can take a look at the accepted substance list, because it only includes those substances that are actually being used. And that is not just like a recommendation of what should be used.
Well, and that kind of reporting could be tremendously powerful. But you mentioned earlier that, you don't have the chemical number, you have the trade name. Are we going to need some form of interpretation of the trade name in order to map it back to the underlying chemical structure?
No, what the majority of chemicals that we have on the accepted substance list are by CAS unique CAS identifier.
Okay.
What I meant was with the trade name is that if some suppliers that have a new chemical, a new formulation, which they want to keep confidential, then they could go through the trade name assessment and keep that, the concentrations and the types of chemicals that are in that, as confidential, proprietary information. That's an alternative. But what we rather see is the unique identifiers, or the chemicals that are used within that formulation by a CAS number on our list. When I start to look at the formulations, a lot of these formulations have very common mixtures, very common types of chemicals in them. Perhaps they'll have one unique chemical that separates them from another chemical, another trade name, at a very small amount in that, but it makes it a different trade name. But a lot of the chemicals that make up 100%, they're very similar.
We live in an increasingly complex world, particularly in terms of the design of the things that we use. How does TCO plan over the course of the next half of the decade to, say, 2030, continue to invest in shining light into these decisions that we're making so that we have greater and greater insight into the impact of what we buy?
Our plan is to continue investing in and expanding on the accepted substance list. As I said, I've started the research already into the next process chemical, which is going to be adhesives and lubricants that are used on the production lines. And these appear to, so far, use a large number of toxic substances that should be banned, really. This work will also deepen, as we look into the next phase for the accepted substances. It will deepen the partnership, I think, with organizations like Green Screen and Chem Forward, and also certain licensed profilers like Tox Services, as we look for the safer alternatives and make those safer alternatives public for everyone. So I will continue to message that our safer alternatives list can be used, and it's a viable alternative for more products than just the IT we certify. I think that these alternatives can be used for TVs, anything from TVs to toasters, basically. Basically making anything that's electronic and uses plastic can really benefit from our accepted substance list.
Are there areas, particularly product categories like batteries, that since we're in the midst of a transition to an electrified society, we need to be paying more attention to as they rapidly innovate with new chemistries and packaging? To your point, I mean, one of the problems with the battery is that it is actually an immense amalgam of different chemicals trying to hold the electric charge. Are we going to be able to keep up with the innovation?
Yeah, absolutely. The chemical suppliers are well ahead of the curve. Like I say, they have very extensive portfolios of the chemicals that are suitable for certain applications. And of course, innovation is going to lead perhaps to less chemicals being needed. We can see that, as it comes to flame retardants, for example, you can build a product where the encasing will not need flame retardants. You can set flame retardants on the printed circuit board and cover that with a metal sheeting, for example, and that will get rid of the need for flame retardants being used in the encasing. When it comes to packaging, I think, unfortunately, substances like brominated flame retardants and hazardous effluent that are still common within the electronics Even the persistent PFAS, which is becoming a very well-known subject these days. If back in the day we had an accepted substance list for frying pans or cloves, and PFAS wouldn't be everywhere, the everywhere chemical that it is today. When you talk about packaging and reuse and how we're going to do, then I think a worrying report that I read the other day was showing high levels of flame retardants used in kitchen utensils and foods, for software and toys even. I was reading that a polystyrene sushi tray had 12,000 parts per million of deca BDE. I mean, this is a regulated brominated flame retardant. And I can only assume that this is all coming from recycled plastics that are being used. So we have to start. I mean, if we want to become really sustainable about chemicals, and we want to be able to reuse these products and have safer reused products, and be able to refurbish electronics, also to be able to sell on, then we have to get serious about chemical industry, and we have to change the strategy from restriction to positive listing. And sometimes these portfolios, they're there, they're prepared, they have safe alternatives, and sometimes I just get a bit skeptical that it's just a matter of cost, really, that it comes down to that choice.
Yeah, too often I believe you're right. People choose to make a little more money over to be safe, both for the customer and for the environment. So you've created an important resource. How can listeners learn more and particularly keep up on what's changing on the accepted substances list?
So listeners can learn more by visiting, TCO Development's official website, which is tcocertified.com, where you can access the resources that we have, the research that we've done, the webinars, and also register if you're really interested in following the accepted substance list. You can register to be notified when an update happens to our accepted substance list, and it can be every month because it's a dynamic list. Chemical suppliers are adding quite regularly new substances to the list that are being used and they want to be used. Also, please check out additionally Green Screen and Chem Forward. They offer the insights into their safer alternatives, and I can recommend checking out what Washington State is also doing. They've gone out and they banned halogenated flame retardants from electronic products. One of the reasons was our accepted substance list was showing that there were enough safer non-halogenated alternatives available to be able to do this. They were taken to court by it, and they won. And they're trailblazers to me, and I hope other states follow their example.
We hope so too. Stephen, thank you so much for your time today. It's really been fascinating, and we'll encourage folks to check out TCO's site so they can keep up on this story. But thank you.
Thank you.
You've been listening to a conversation with Stephen Fuller, Senior Criteria Manager at TCO Development, a global IT procurement best practices organization that encourages safer chemical usage through information campaigns and, as you've heard, an evolving product passport system. You can learn more about TCO Development and the accepted substances list at TCOcertified.com. TCO Certified is all one word, no space, no dash, TCOcertified.com. IT buyers living in a market-based economy need valid, transparent sources of information to make informed buying decisions. Yet the complexity of and constantly evolving technologies used in our technology products makes keeping abreast of what is safe for humans and nature a constant challenge. TCO Development, Green Screen, and Chem Forward have built a collaboration that helps enterprise IT buyers exert their desire to use safer alternatives to toxic chemicals. And those insights are filtering down even to those of us in the consumer electronics world. But as Stephen noted, we're still working to make TCO's accepted substances list a standard for appliances like TVs, toasters, or microwaves, so that every one of us can join in the call for safer electronics. Once that product passport that we've discussed has become a common tool for understanding what chemicals we're being exposed to through our technologies, buyers, not the producers, will be empowered to track what chemicals they are exposed to and advocate through their spending and their conversational influence for the least harmful, least environmentally damaging practices. That cannot happen soon enough and should be a priority for policymakers across the political spectrum because people need to make informed choices, and that's possible only when they can see past the marketing curtain into the long-term impact of their purchases. So we will continue to track TCO's progress here on Sustainability in Your Ear. And you can help by spreading the word about this episode or any of the hundreds of interviews in our archives. Writing a review on your favorite podcast platform about sustainability in your ear will help your neighbors find us. That makes you the amplifier who can spread more ideas to create less waste. So please tell your friends, your family, your coworkers, the folks you meet on the street that they can find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, Audible, or whatever purveyor of podcast goodness they prefer. Thank you for your support. I'm Mitch Ratcliffe. This is Sustainability in Your Ear, and we will be back with another innovator interview soon. In the meantime, folks, take care of yourself, take care of one another, and let's all take care of this beautiful planet of ours. Have a green day.